The topic of this video lecture will be the populist movement, the reformers who get no recognition. So let's start with a quick question. What is a movement? Well, I'm going to define a movement as a group of people who share ideas and have a common cause they want addressed. So what was the populist movement? Well, it was literally just a movement of people, that is, ordinary, working class people, who came together to argue for and advocate for changes to the capitalist system in the late 1800s to curb and restrain many of the large-scale corporations and trusts that we've already discussed in some detail when we looked at the Gilded Age. And this movement is going to move into the realm of politics. That is, it engaged in political activity to win elected office at all levels of government, national, state, and local. So this will be the first time, I think, this year that we really begin to look at politics, something that surrounds us with elections coming up or ongoing all the time. So what about the populist movement, and why do we need to know it? Well, I think it's important because, again, I think they are a movement that came into existence in the late 1800s and went out of existence by about 1896. So they didn't even make it to the 20th century. So why should we know about them? Why bother? Because many of the ideas that the populists put forward actually became laws in the 20th century and led to important major reforms that changed the way American society operated and influenced and shaped, moreover, the beliefs of American people. So therefore, I think the populists deserve their day, and that's what we're going to try to do in today's lecture. So let's go look at the populists, and you see there a picture of a Midwestern farmer, and you might be thinking, why are we talking about farmers? Well, it's because the populist and the populist movement really came out of the great farmlands in the Midwest in the Gilded Age, really. So we're going to start in the late 1860s into the 1870s. So why was this the case, that the populist movement came from the great farmlands? Well, that's a good question. And it's really because the farmers that had moved to the farmland in the 1850s and 1860s, in large part as a result of the Homestead Act of 1862, the Civil War, people moving to open and freer areas of the nation to try their lot in the farming business. Well, they had hard times. They struggled, these farmers, with harsh weather, drought, or some cases too much rain, insects, grasshopper and locust invasions, and there was also wild price fluctuations in the markets for agricultural goods, in addition to international competition. So farmers had a hard time making ends meet due to these various factors. But farmers also had to pay rather high prices to ship their farm goods to markets on the East Coast and the West Coast, or down to New Orleans in the South. So they had high prices. They had to pay a lot of money, in other words, to conduct their farming business, and this led them to borrow money in order to meet expenses, and this led to farmers really being pressed. They were in debt. So you might say, well, okay, Mr. King, really, why do I need to know about these farmers? And I get it. Typically, we don't talk a lot about farmers, but the movement is really going to start in the year 1867 when a man named Kelly, a farmer himself, formed what is today known as the Granger Movement. And it was made up of farmers in the Midwest, and it was sort of a fraternity of sorts. That is, farmers that joined this loose association, like a fraternity, to help its members. So members were helping each other out, especially in hard times. The Panic of 1873, something we've discussed, led to very low prices for farmers. Yet railroads kept shipping prices very high. And this was really going to hurt farmers again. Farmers really struggled. So the Grange movement did something interesting. They got into politics. And here's where we're going to start talking about politics in our course this year. And in fact, they were able to elect representatives in state and local governments across the mid to upper Midwest. And then once elected, these representatives pressured state legislatures to pass a series of laws to regulate the market and transport for agricultural products, that is, farm goods. And this is an example of what we already defined as state action versus the idea of laissez-faire. State action, to remind you, is when government uses its power to demand or require people and or corporations to do certain things that they otherwise would not do. So the Granger movement morphs into a political movement, and they're very successful in getting state legislatures to pass laws limiting railroad rates. Or the other great cost farmers had was once you harvest the wheat or the corn, you had to store it. So storage prices and storage facilities often charge farmers really, really high prices. So these laws set rates or set maximum rates or prices for transportation and storage prices, and they were quite successful. However, the Granger movement itself disappeared in the late 1870s into the early 1880s as the economy rebounded from the panic of 1873. Farm prices went up, and life was much better for farmers. However, the market for farm goods experienced another strong downturn in the 1880s, and a new movement emerged. So you get the sense that the American economy works in cycles, boom, bust, boom, bust. So by the 1880s, farmers were again experiencing great problems with the high costs and a lot of debt. And this time they formed what were known as farmers' alliances. And I guess here you can see sort of the economic rendition of, too much supply led to a drop in prices. And then you would have times when there wasn't enough supply due to drought or insect invasions. And so farmers are really kind of conditioned or linked to rather boring charts like this, but that's just there to show you that the problem of economics. So here we go into political action. And I already discussed the Granger laws, but now we're going to discuss the Farm Alliance movement. And by the late 1880s, there were some 6 million farmers in the various farmer alliance movements that existed in the Midwest and in the South. And then by 1889, the two major farm alliances merged into one big happy farm alliance fraternity. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? The alliance movement then produced colorful characters, such as a woman named Mary Elizabeth Least, who encouraged farmers to raise less corn and more hell. And by that, she meant that farmers should engage in political action, win elected offices, and then pass laws that would benefit them. The Farmer Alliance is then what becomes the Populist Movement in the early 1890s. So we talked about Granger's in 1867, and then we have the Farm Alliance in the 1880s, and then we have the Populist Movement in the 1890s. So that's why we talked a little bit about farming. So who is this? The People's Party, or the Populist Party, replaces the Farmers Alliance movement. Farmers realized that the only way they could win their fight against the big railroad trusts and against the banks to whom they were greatly indebted was to form, again, a new political party. And this third party, again, there were the Republicans and the Democrats already, the two main parties in the United States, then and now. A third party would be an alternative to these mainstream parties, and that this new party, this third party, would advocate for the interests of farmers and the people more generally, insisting that different state and local governments use their power to restrain and regulate the trusts. And that's exactly what they do. And here you can see the flag of one of the alliance movements down in Texas, 1878. And you can see some of the words there: alliance, free trade, justice, wisdom, 'tis most good for the most people. So you can see some of the values that they believed in. And then you can see the early political poster there, the People's Party at the top, and that's Thomas E. Watson. He was going to be a presidential candidate in the 1892 presidential election for the Populist Party, and he came out of the Farmers Alliance and then moves into the Populist Party. The other man you see there is 1896, the candidate for presidency for both the Democratic Party and the Populist Party, William Jennings Bryan, somebody we read briefly when we discussed imperialism. So by 1896, the Populist Party joined the Democratic Party and got behind William Jennings Bryan. He would ultimately lose the election of 1896, but nonetheless, the Populist Party had risen tremendously in the public eye by 1896. So let's look at the 1892 Populist Party platform, because I think that's rather interesting. The party itself met, I believe, in Omaha, Nebraska, and at its convention to kick off the 1892 political campaign for the presidency, they said these words, and I think these words are really interesting, and I'll quote them. We might come back to them later in class. I might hand these out. We meet, and I quote from the actual platform, we meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates the ballot box, the legislatures, the Congress, and touches even the ermine of the bench, that is, the judges. The people are demoralized. The fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for a few, unprecedented in the history of mankind. And the possessors of those, in turn, despise the republic and endanger liberty itself. We seek to restore the government of the republic to the hands of the plain people. End quote. So I think you can see that the Populist Party is expressing very clearly its distrust of the great, big, colossal fortunes of the very few trust owners, that these trust owners had wrecked liberty, wrecked competition, wrecked the republic, destroyed justice, and what the Populist Party wants to do is restore balance to the system, political and economic system, to make things better for the plain people. So I think that's a very powerful thing. And the last thing we're going to end with today is, and there might be a short video I can play, but the Populist Party platform. So in 1892, again, the Populist Party is going to run for the office of president. And while they won't succeed, they had a very long party platform. And a party platform is simply a list of ideas. So you'll hear today the Democratic Party platform or the Republican Party platform. All it means is a list of ideas. And they used to literally stand on a platform and shout out the ideas that a party stood for prior to a big election. So that's where the idea of platform comes from. So it's a useful term to know. The party platform that of the Populists in 1892 included such things as a national currency. Many don't know that there was no national currency at that time. Each state had its own currency, and large banks had their own currencies that they issued. The Populists called for an income tax to limit the accumulation of vast fortunes by people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan. So the government should own railroads. There should be no gold standard. There should be the direct election of senators. There should be no land grants or special favors by governments to large corporations because they hurt the common man. National banks should be eliminated. Free silver, the use of silver to print more paper money should be encouraged. The government should own grain storage centers to help farmers. That the people should be able to introduce laws and vote on them in something called the referendum and the initiative. There should be secret ballots instead of open ballots. And last but not least, the 8-hour workday. So the Populist Party platform is rich. It's varied. Again, they failed in the 1892 election and in the 1896 election, and they're going to disappear. But many of the ideas that I just talked about, and some of them that you see on the screen, would actually come into existence not too long after in the early 20th century when we talk about the progressive movement that we're going to study next. So I'm going to play a short video clip here for you guys to listen. We'll see how this works.
As did two other political groups, the Populists and the Socialists. After the Civil War, many Americans returned to or began farming, but over the next decades there was an overproduction of farm goods. With more supply than demand, prices plummeted lower and lower. At the same time, the cost of seed, fertilizer, and railroad transportation increased, leaving more and more farmers little money to support their families and still pay their debts to bankers. In protest, farmers began to organize political parties. Of them, the Populist Party emerged as the most powerful. The Populists supported an income tax based on earnings to support the government rather than the tariffs then charged to farmers and businesses. They demanded a shorter workday, government loans to farmers, the direct election of state senators, secret ballot voting, and other election reforms. But Republican William McKinley...
Okay, so with that, we will end this video lecture. Thank you very much.